The rope was already around his neck when Deputy Hale smiled. Robert Williams stood on the back of a wagon in the middle of Milford's main street, wrists bound behind him, the morning sun cutting hard across the dust. A small crowd had gathered, not out of sympathy, but out of habit. This was what Milford did with men who caused trouble. It made an example of them. Robert had caused trouble, not the kind a man plans, but the kind that finds him anyway. A shove, a drawn weapon, a deputy with a bruised jaw and a personal grudge. Now here he stood, 29 years old, with nothing to his name, and a noose fitted to his throat, like it had always belonged there. He didn't beg. He'd learned early that begging only made men like Hale feel powerful, and Hale already had too much of that. So Robert held still, jaw tight, eyes forward, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was not death. Hale raised one hand, and the crowd went quiet. He stepped forward slowly, the kind of slow that belongs to men who enjoy being watched, and looked up at Robert with an expression that wasn't quite mercy and wasn't quite cruelty. Something in between, something calculated. He said there was another option. A woman named Karen George needed a husband. Her family's ranch was struggling, and the county needed the land to stay productive and in good hands. Robert would marry her, work the ranch, and keep his life. It was framed as generosity. But as Robert looked down into Hale's steady, unhurried eyes, something in his gut told him this was not generosity. Men like Hale didn't give things away. They made investments. Robert didn't know what he was being used for yet. He just knew the rope was still there, and Karen George was the only door out. He said yes. The George Ranch sat 6 miles east of Milford, past a broken windmill and a stretch of red dirt road that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Robert rode beside the deputy's man in silence, his wrists finally free, the rope's ghost still faint against his throat. When the ranch came into view, it was not what he expected. It was not grand, but it was not defeated either. The fences were worn but standing. The house was modest but solid. Someone had fought hard to keep this place alive, and it showed in every patched board and every straight fence post. A woman stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching him ride in like she was already tired of him. She was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from years of holding things together through sheer will. That was Karen George, and the look on her face told Robert everything. She had not been asked. She had been told. He dismounted and walked toward her. She didn't move. "You're the tramp," she said. It wasn't a question. "Robert Williams," he answered. "I know who you are," she said. "What I don't know is why Hale thought sending me a man with a rope mark on his neck was doing me a favor." Robert said nothing. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside and held the door open. "You sleep in the barn," she said. "You eat after the hands. You don't touch anything in this house without asking. And don't mistake this for a marriage. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Robert nodded once. Understood. She looked at him like she was waiting for him to argue. He didn't. She turned and walked inside, and Robert stood in the yard alone, looking at the land stretching out in every direction, flat and wide and indifferent. He had been in worse places. He told himself that and almost believed it. Before we go further, if you're feeling this story, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and trust me, you're part of this journey. Now let's get back to this, because what happens next between Robert and Karen? You won't see it coming. Robert had been on the ranch 4 days when he first heard the name Henry Cole. He heard it the way you hear a name that means trouble. Quietly. between people who didn't want it carried far. He was mending a fence along the south pasture when two of the ranch hands, Earl and a younger boy named Doss, stopped working and started talking in low voices. A rider had been spotted along the eastern boundary again. Third time that week. Earl spat in the dirt and said, "Cole's men don't come this close unless he's moving on something." Robert kept working, but listened. That evening at supper, he asked Karen directly. She set down her fork and looked at him across the table like she was deciding how much he deserved to know. Then she told him. Henry Cole was a land agent, working on behalf of interests she couldn't fully trace. For 2 years, he had been pressuring the George Ranch, disputing boundary lines, filing forged claims at the county office, running off buyers who might have helped them, and making sure credit dried up in Milford so her father couldn't borrow against the land. And the law? Robert asked. Karen's expression didn't change. "Deputy Hale knows," she said quietly. "He's done nothing." She picked up her fork again. Robert sat with that. The law knew, and the law was silent. In Milford, silence had a price. He just didn't know yet who was paying it. The next morning, Robert rode the full boundary of the ranch alone. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, not as a man passing through, but as a man trying to understand what he had walked into. What he found unsettled him. The eastern fence line had markers that didn't match the deed Karen had shown him. Small things. A post slightly out of place. A painted stone moved from where weathering said it had always been. Someone had been at this land, carefully, methodically, like a man who intended to take it, but wanted it to look like mathematics instead of theft. Robert dismounted at the far eastern corner and crouched beside a boundary post that had fresh dirt around its base. It had been moved, not long ago. He stood and looked east toward where Cole's men had been spotted, then looked back west toward the ranch house, small in the distance. 4 days ago, this was not his problem. He pressed his boot against the post, feeling its resistance in the soil. He was starting to think that maybe it was. Robert didn't tell Karen what he had found. Not yet. He rose before dawn the next morning, loaded the wagon with a post driver, fresh timber and a coil of wire, and rode out to the eastern boundary alone. The sky was still gray, and the air carried the cold that comes just before the sun commits to rising. He worked in silence, methodically pulling the moved post from its false position and resetting it where the deed said it belonged. The ground was harder than it looked, and the work took 2 hours, but he didn't rush it. Every strike of the post driver felt deliberate, not anger exactly, but something close to it. A quiet refusal. When he was done, he stood back and looked at the line. Straight. Correct. His. He wasn't sure when he had started thinking of it that way, but the thought had arrived without asking permission, and he let it stay. He loaded his tools back onto the wagon and sat for a moment, looking out at the flat, open land, catching the first real light of morning. It was good land, worth fighting for. He clicked the horse forward and rode back toward the house. Karen was in the yard when he returned, arms crossed, watching him unhitch the wagon with an expression caught between suspicion and something she wasn't ready to name. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Eastern boundary," he said, lifting the post driver down. "Someone moved a marker. I reset it." She was quiet for a moment. "You did that alone?" "Wasn't complicated," he said. "It needed doing." She studied him the way she always did, like she was looking for the angle, the hidden motive, the thing men usually wanted. She didn't find one. "Cole's men will notice," she said. "Good," Robert answered, and walked past her toward the barn. Karen stood in the yard and watched him go. She had known men who talked about protecting things. Robert had simply gone out before sunrise and done it. She turned back toward the house, and for the first time since this arrangement had been forced on her, She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. The faint, cautious possibility that she was not entirely alone in this. The raid came on a Thursday, just past midnight. Robert heard it before he saw it. The low rumble of hooves moving fast. Too many and too coordinated to be anything natural. He was out of the barn in seconds, rifle in hand, boots barely laced. The south pasture was alive with movement. Dark shapes driving the George cattle hard toward the eastern fence line. Cole's men. 4 of them, maybe 5, working with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Robert fired once into the air and shouted. The riders didn't stop. He ran for his horse, mounted bareback, and pushed hard into the dark after them. He cut off the lead rider at the fence line, forcing him to pull up sharp. The man cursed and wheeled his horse around. For a moment they faced each other in the moonlight, Robert breathing hard, rifle leveled, the rider's face hidden under a low hat brim. Then the man turned and rode east, and the others followed. The cattle slowed and milled in confusion. Robert sat in the dark and counted them until his breathing steadied. They were all there. Barely. He was driving the last of the cattle back toward the pasture when Karen appeared on horseback beside him, a rifle across her saddle. She had come out without being called. They worked together without speaking, moving the herd back from the fence line in the thin moonlight, reading each other's movements the way people do when something unspoken has already been agreed upon. When the last animal was settled, they stopped their horses side by side and looked out at the dark eastern boundary. "They'll come back," Karen said. "I know," Robert answered. "We need to be ready." She looked at him then, really looked at him, not with suspicion or calculation, but with the straight, honest look of someone standing in danger and choosing who to stand with. "You didn't have to ride out," she said. Robert kept his eyes on the fence line. "Yes, I did," he said quietly. Neither of them said anything after that. They rode back to the house in silence, close enough that their horses' shoulders nearly touched, and the distance that had existed between them since the day he arrived felt for the first time measurably smaller. The morning after the raid, the ranch was quiet in the way that follows danger. Everything still standing, but nothing quite the same. Robert sat on the porch steps before breakfast, cleaning his rifle, when Karen came out and sat in the chair behind him without a word. She set 2 cups of coffee on the railing and slid one toward him. He took it. They sat like that for a while, the early light spreading slow and gold across the yard, neither of them in a hurry to break the silence. It was Karen who spoke first. "My father built this ranch with $12 and a mule," she said. "He was dead before Cole started moving on us. I think about that sometimes, that he never knew what was coming for everything he built." Robert turned the rifle over in his hands. "How long have you been holding this alone?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. 2 years, she said, since my brother left for Colorado and never came back." Robert nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty words. He just let the weight of what she had carried sit in the open air between them where it belonged, and somehow that felt like more than anything he could have said. "You were a tramp," Karen said after a while. Not accusatory, just honest, the way she said most things. "What were you running from?" Robert was quiet long enough that she might have thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Nothing worth talking about. A lot of bad decisions, and one town that stopped forgiving them." He looked out at the land. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to have something worth losing." Karen wrapped both hands around her cup. "And now?" she asked. Robert didn't answer right away. He looked at the fence line he had ridden in the dark, at the cattle moving slow and easy in the morning pasture, at the house her father had built with $12 and a mule. He thought about the boundary post he had reset before sunrise, without being asked, and the way it had felt, like something that mattered. "Now, I don't know," he said finally. But the way he said it was different from before. It didn't sound like a man with no answer. It sounded like a man who was afraid of the one he had. Robert made the decision on a Sunday. He didn't announce it, and he didn't ask permission. He rose before the house was awake, dressed in the dark, and began saddling his horse in the quiet of the barn. He had spent 3 days thinking about it. The moved marker, the midnight raid, the forged claims Karen had described at supper. He had turned it over and over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone, looking for the edge that makes sense. The law in Milford was useless. Hale had made that clear by his silence. But the Territorial Land Office in Hartwell was a different matter. If Cole was filing forged boundary claims, there would be a paper trail, and paper trails could be challenged with documentation. Robert had asked Karen for the original deed and every survey record her father had kept. She had handed them over without asking why, which told him she trusted him more than either of them had said out loud. He tucked them inside his coat, mounted up, and rode north into the gray morning. Hartwell was 3 hours away. He had never done anything like this in his life, ridden toward a problem instead of away from it. The feeling was unfamiliar. It wasn't entirely unpleasant. The land office in Hartwell was a narrow building wedged between a hardware store and a telegraph office, staffed by a thin clerk named Aldous, who wore spectacles and looked at Robert the way people looked at tramps who wandered into official buildings. Robert set the deed and the survey records on the counter and explained the situation plainly. Forged boundary claims, a relocated marker, 2 years of systematic pressure against the George Ranch. Aldous looked at the documents carefully, then looked at Robert, then looked at the documents again. "These records are clean," he said slowly. "The George deed is properly filed, and the survey dates are consistent." Robert leaned on the counter. "Then Cole's claims are forgeries," he said. Aldous removed his spectacles and rubbed them with his sleeve. "If what you're telling me is accurate, this warrants an investigation." "It's accurate," Robert said. Aldous looked at him for a long moment, then reached for a form beneath the counter. "I'll need you to sign a formal complaint," he said. Robert picked up the pen without hesitation. 3 weeks ago, he had been a tramp with a noose around his neck and nothing to his name. Today, he was signing documents to protect land that technically wasn't even his. He signed his name slowly and clearly, Robert Williams, and pushed the form back across the counter. Something had changed in him. He could feel it in the steadiness of his own hand. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, nailed to the front door of the ranch house with a skinning knife. Robert found it at dawn during his morning walk of the property. He pulled the knife free, unfolded the paper, and read it once. Then he read it again. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The message was simple and precise. Vacate the George Ranch within 7 days, or face consequences that would not be limited to the land. Cole had shown up before, pressed before, sent riders in the dark before. But this was different. This was not a land agent filing paperwork and moving boundary markers. This was a direct, personal threat delivered with a blade, and it had a precision to it that felt rehearsed, like someone had decided that patience was finished, and it was time to frighten people instead. Robert stood in the early morning light and turned the knife over in his hand. Cole didn't operate this way on his own. He was a man who hid behind documents and forged claims. Someone above him had changed the instructions, and whoever that was had decided the ranch was taking too long to break. Robert thought about Hale, his calm smile at the wagon, his unhurried eyes, the deal that had never felt like mercy. The stone that had been sitting in his gut since day one settled deeper. He told Karen at breakfast. He set the letter on the table in front of her without preamble and watched her read it. Her face didn't break, That wasn't Karen's way, but her jaw tightened, and she set the paper down slowly, the way you set something down when your hands want to do something else entirely. 7 days, she said flatly. He's never put a deadline on it before. Because someone told him to, Robert said. Cole's been pressing you for 2 years with paperwork and riders. This letter isn't his style. It's someone else's patience running out. Karen looked at him steadily. Hale, she asked. Robert met her eyes. I don't know yet. But the investigator from Hartwell is coming. We hold the line until he gets here. She nodded once, slow and decided. And if Cole's men come before that? Robert folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. Evidence, carefully kept. Then, we don't make it easy for them, he said. Karen looked at him across the table, at the man who had arrived with a rope mark on his neck and nothing to offer, and she thought about how wrong that first impression had been. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie in long, slow waves. The fence line held, but both of them knew the 7 days had already started. The letter arrived early on the 5th morning, slipped under the front door, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Robert picked it up, read it, and walked straight to the kitchen where Karen was already up and starting the stove. He set it on the table without a word. She read it quickly. It was from Wallace Pruitt, territorial investigator, requesting that both Robert and Karen Williams present themselves in Hartwell by midday. He had reviewed the formal complaint and the documentation. He was ready to move. Karen looked up from the letter. Both of us, she said. Robert nodded. Both of us. They rode out within the hour, side by side on the open road, the morning air cool and sharp against their faces. It was the first time they had ridden together towards something instead of simply defending against it, and both of them felt the difference without naming it. The road to Hartwell stretched flat and long before them, and for once, the land didn't feel like something closing in. It felt like something opening up. Pruitt was a compact, unhurried man with a territorial badge pinned to a worn brown coat and eyes that had seen enough dishonesty to recognize it quickly. He met them at his office, sat them down, and laid everything on the table. The forged boundary claims, the funded raids, the threatening letter, the financial trail his investigation had uncovered. He spoke plainly and without drama, the way men do when the facts are damning enough on their own. Cole had not been operating alone. Every forged document, every midnight raid, every calculated pressure had been financed and directed by one man, Deputy Hale. Hale had identified the George Ranch 2 years ago as vulnerable land and used Cole as his instrument, keeping his own name buried beneath layers of paperwork. He had engineered the forced marriage himself, betting that a tramp with a rope mark on his neck would either run or fail, leaving the ranch legally exposed. The office was very quiet. Karen sat perfectly still beside Robert, her hands folded on the table. Robert felt something cold and clarifying move through him, the smile at the wagon, the unhurried eyes. The deal that had never been mercy. All of it, a calculation. Pruitt looked at Robert directly. He miscalculated, he said simply. Outside, Hartwell went about its afternoon as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The territorial ruling came 3 days after their meeting with Pruitt. A rider delivered the official document to the ranch. The boundary dispute was settled in favor of the George Ranch. All of Cole's filed claims were declared fraudulent and struck from the county record, and both Henry Cole and Deputy Hale were taken into territorial custody pending trial. A new deputy had been appointed in Milford, a quiet man named Casper, who had no interest in anyone's land. Robert read the document at the kitchen table and set it down in the center where Karen could see it. She read it slowly, all the way to the bottom. Then sat back in her chair and let out a long breath, the kind that carries years in it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. There was nothing that needed saying right away. The ranch was theirs. The land her father had built with $12 and a mule was safe, and the men who had tried to take it were finished. Outside, Earl and Doss were already back at work along the south fence, and the cattle moved easy and unhurried across the pasture in the late morning light. The George Ranch looked exactly as it always had, but something underneath it had shifted permanently. That evening, Robert sat on the porch steps as the sun went down, turning the sky above the prairie into long streaks of amber and rose. He heard the door open behind him, and Karen came out and sat beside him, not in the chair, but on the steps, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They watched the light fade together without rushing it. After a while, Karen said quietly, "You could have left. After the raid, after the letter. Any of it. Nothing was keeping you here." Robert was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the last thin line of light above the flat land. "Because for the first time in my life," he said slowly, "leaving felt like the wrong thing to do." Karen held his gaze for a moment, then looked back out at the prairie. A small smile crossed her face, not the guarded, careful kind she had worn since the day he arrived, but something quieter and more real. "Good," she said softly. That was all. The words sat between them warm and unhurried, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to it. The prairie stretched wide and open before them, and the ranch behind them held steady in the growing dark. And Robert Williams, tramp, drifter, a man who had never stayed anywhere long enough to matter, stayed. And that is the story of Robert Williams and Karen George. Two people brought together by desperation and deception, who found in each other something neither of them was looking for: steadiness, loyalty, and the quiet courage to stay. The George Ranch survived, the land held, and the man nobody believed in became exactly what the woman who needed him most never knew she was waiting for. If this story moved you, don't go far. There's another one waiting for you right now on the end screen. Click it, and let's do this again.